questions at the end. The next speaker is Schiller, Research Director for Policy Matters, Ohio.
Good afternoon, everyone. You probably know Policy Matters Ohio. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute with offices including in Columbus. We see a number of reasons to be skeptical of prison privatization that's been proposed, ranging from transparency issues to questions of what kind of incentives are created when you place prisons in private ownership. But what we did is, knowing that some kind of proposal like this might be forthcoming, some months ago we contracted with Bob Paynter, who's a longtime investigative journalist, both at the Academic Journal and at the Plain Dealer in Cleveland, to take a look at private prisons, and he focused especially on the cost issues. I think that people who generally support this kind of thing do so on the basis that it's going to save money. So I guess we would just like to allow Bob to share his conclusions as a longtime reporter and somebody who came to this in an objective spirit to say what did he learn about the state's own legal requirement, which does say that we're supposed to save 5% off the operation of the private prisons that we've had.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Zach said, I'm Bob Paynter. My background is in journalism. I've been freelancing and doing other matters for the last couple of years, and we looked up in February to take a look at this issue. Private prisons raise a host of questions for policymakers to consider. Many having to do with the impact of the profit motive on corrections quality, public safety, and accountability. But given that the only real rationale that has been given, that's been put forward for private prisons here, has been that they're cheaper than public ones, my primary line of inquiry was just that. Have they actually saved around taxpayers any money, and if so, how much? Ohio officials have claimed savings of more than $45 million over the last decade for their 2 private prisons, well in excess of the 5% savings that state law requires relative to a comparable facility run by the state. In response to a public records request, Policy Matters obtained 3 spreadsheets that detailed how officials arrived at those calculations for the last 3 biennia, 2006 through 7, 08, 09, and 2010 and 11. And that's where I started my inquiry. And quite frankly, I was surprised by what I found. First of all, a strong caveat is in order. I don't know and can't say whether private prisons save money in Ohio or anywhere else. The research on that question is ambiguous. What I think I can say, however, after a detailed examination of their own calculations and assumptions, is that Ohio officials don't know either. On the eve of Governor Kasich's announced expansion, officials of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, who had been tinkering for more than a year with what they admit is a serious flawed savings formula, were still proposing fundamental revisions to the calculations that appear to call into question much of the private prison savings they've been touting for years. As I wrote for Policy Matters, the state's methods for calculating the seemingly robust savings had changed substantially and in some cases inexplicably over the last several years. Not only have the state's calculations been riddled with errors, oversights, and omissions of significant data, but they also have been potentially tainted by controversial accounting assumptions that many experts consider deeply flawed. Once corrected, the savings projected by the state's calculations shrink dramatically. In some years, they become losses, and depending on how certain expenses are handled, fall below the 5% requirement in each of the years examined. I'll not go into detail on all of the numbers here. They're presented in the report, but to give you an idea of the quality of the state's proof of private prison savings, here are some of the problems and inconsistencies found in the state's savings calculations for the Lake Erie Correctional Facility in Conneaut. This institution is the one for which comparisons can most easily be made. For fiscal 2006-2007, the state estimated staff requirement at a comparable state facility at 310, when the actual figure was something less than 277, an overstatement of at least 12%. The state officials calculated that Lake Erie would save about $4.36 per inmate per day in department overhead costs, a figure at least 6 times too high based on the state's recent revisions. For fiscal 2008-09, the state overestimated the staff required at the comparable state facility by 16%, 320 versus the actual figure of 277. Used the wrong year's salary figures to calculate the comparable's personnel costs. After computing a $6.42 savings per inmate per day on overhead costs, they neglected to include the figure in their calculation as they had in the previous biennium and would in the next biennium. And they neglected to include in Lake Erie's costs more than $300,000 in inmate pay that the state reimbursed to the private operator. For fiscal 2010 and 11, the state underestimated the staff required at the comparable state facility by about 4%. They calculated Lake Erie's savings of about $4 per inmate per day in department overhead, when the figure should have been a maximum of about 75 cents, according to recent state revisions, if it's used at all. They neglected to include nearly $350,000 each year in the reimbursed inmate pay, and neglected to account for nearly $440,000 in medical expenses that the state reimbursed to the private operator in 2010. Finally, the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction issued a statement criticizing the study for being incomplete and aimed at accomplishing policy matters' ideological objectives, their words, and criticized me for making broad assumptions that benefit my client's point of view. The department also released a new set of private prison savings numbers that are based on what it described as an updated cost savings model that, quote, the Kasich administration believes is more accurate, close quote. The department simply declared these numbers, which are all different than those published previously, to be the actual savings, without showing any of its work in how it reached those numbers. In interviews with state officials when I was working on the study, I was assured that the new methodology that they were developing, once finalized and approved by the department hierarchy and the Office of Budget Management, would be posted on the ODRC website for all to see, for all to examine, and presumably for all to suggest improvements. When I asked them just prior to the release of the study, the new methodology had been finalized and posted, they declined to respond, and I've seen nothing posted today. Thank you.